Segment 1: Mao's first 5-year plan, the Soviet blueprint that transformed China. When the Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of People's Republic of China in 1949, the country was economically devastated. Decades of civil war and the Second Sino-Japanese War and internal conflict had left factories destroyed, transportation networks in ruins, and agricultural production barely sufficient to feed the population. China's industrial output was among the lowest in the world, and over 80% of its people believed China's industrial output was among the lowest in the world, and over 80% of its people lived as poor peasants. Mao believed that without rapid industrialization, China would remain vulnerable to foreign powers and unable to establish itself as a major global force. Rather than allowing gradual market driven development, Mao and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party decided to adopt this centralized economic planning model. Pioneered by the Soviet Union with extensive Soviet financial assistance, technical expertise, and industrial planning, China launched its first 5-year plan in 1953. The objective was straightforward but extraordinarily ambitious: transform an overwhelmingly agrarian economy into a modern industrial state through direct government control of investment, production, and resource allocation. The government nationalized major industries, expanded state ownership of banks and transportation, and placed economic planning under central authorities. Instead of private entrepreneurs deciding what to produce, government planners established production targets for every major sector. Heavy industries including steel, coal, electricity, machinery, and chemicals received overwhelming priority because communist leaders viewed these industries as foundation of military strength, technological progress, and long-term economic independence. Consumer goods and living standards, by comparison, were considered secondary objectives that could be postponed until industrial capacity had been established. To support this transformation, thousands of Soviet engineers, economists, and industrial specialists arrived in China. They helped design factories, train Chinese workers, and oversee what became known as the 156 key industrial projects. Massive steel mills, power plants, machinery factories, and mining operations were constructed across northern and northeastern China. Entire industrial cities expanded around these projects, permanently reshaping China's economic geography for the first time. China possessed a coordinated national strategy aimed at building the industrial foundations of a modern superpower. Segment 2: Building heavy industries at any cost. The first 5-year plan officially began in 1953, and its central philosophy was clear. Heavy industry came before everything else. Inspired by the rapid industrialization achieved under Joseph Stalin, Mao, and Chinese planners believed that steel, coal, machinery, electricity, and defense manufacturing formed the backbone of national power. If China could master these sectors, it could eventually produce everything else, from tractors and trains to aircraft and military equipment. The government directed an unprecedented share of national investment in industry. Nearly 9/10 of state industrial investment flowed into heavy industry, while light industry and consumer goods received far less attention. New steel complexes, coal mines, hydroelectric dams, machine building plants, and chemical factories rose across the country. Cities such as Anshan, Yuan, and Changchun became major industrial centers, housing hundreds of thousands of workers employed in newly constructed state-owned enterprises. These factories didn't operate according to market demand. Instead, every aspect of production was determined through central planning. Government officials established annual quotas for raw materials, labor, machineries, and finished products. Managers were judged primarily by whether they met production targets, not whether factories earned profits or responded to consumer needs. This command economy allowed Beijing to concentrate enormous resources on strategic industries with remarkable speed, but it also created inefficiencies, shortage, and waste that would become increasingly visible in later years. Industrialization required more than factories, it demanded skilled workers and engineers. The government invested heavily in technical schools, universities, and vocational training programs. Tens of thousands of Chinese students were sent to Soviet Union to study engineering, metallurgy, mining, and industrial management before returning to help build China's expanding industrial base. Soviet experts also trained Chinese personnel on site, transferring knowledge that would shape the country's industrial workforce for decades. By the mid 1950s, the results appeared impressive. Coal production surged, electricity generation expanded rapidly, steel output multiplied, and China's industrial capacity grew at one of the fastest rates in the world. To many observers, the first 5-year plan seemed to demonstrate that centralized planning could compress decades of industrial development into just a few years. Yet, beneath these impressive statistics, serious structural weaknesses were already emerging, particularly in agriculture, where millions of peasants were being asked to finance industrial growth through their own labor and production. Segment 3: Collectivizing the countryside to fund industrial growth. While factories and steel mills dominated government propaganda, the true financial engine of the first 5 year plan lay in China's countryside. More than 4 out of every 5 Chinese citizens were farmers, and the communist leadership understood that industrialization could not be financed through foreign investment or private capital. Instead, agriculture would generate the food, labor, and surplus needed to support the industrial revolution. In the early years after land reform, many peasants owned the land they cultivated. However, communist leaders increasingly viewed as millions of small family farms as inefficient and difficult to control. Beginning in 1953, the government encouraged farmers to join small mutual aid teams, which gradually evolved into larger agricultural producers' cooperatives. By 1956, most rural households had been incorporated into collective farms, where land, livestock, and major tools were pooled under collective ownership. The government purchased grain from these collectives at fixed state prices, which were often lower than open market values. This allowed state to feed the rapidly growing urban workforce while keeping food prices low for industrial workers. The difference between what farmers produced and what they received effectively transferred wealth from the countryside to the cities. Those resources were then invested in factories, machineries, railways, power stations, and other industrial projects that formed the backbone of the first 5 year plan. For many peasants, collectivization brought mixed results. Some villages benefited from shared irrigation systems, tractors, improved seeds, and better organization. Others experienced declining incentives. As individual effort no longer translated directly into individual reward, resistance occurred in some regions, but compared with the later campaigns of the late 1950s, collectivization during the first 5 year plan was generally implemented with less violence and greater administrative planning. By the end of 1956, the Communist Party had transformed not only China's industries but also its rural economy. Independent farming had largely disappeared, replaced by collective agriculture under state supervision. This system provided the government with greater control over grain production and rural resources, enabling it to sustain rapid industrial expansion. However, it also made the national economy increasingly dependent on central planning. Any major error in agricultural policy would no longer affect isolated villages, it would affect the food supply of the entire nation, setting the stage for the far more radical experiment that would soon follow, the Great Leap Forward. Segment 4: Successes, Shortcomings, and the Road to the Great Leap Forward. By the time the first 5 year plan concluded in 1957, results appeared remarkably on paper. Industrial production had expanded rapidly, steel output had increased several fold, coal mining reached record levels, electricity generation grew dramatically, and hundreds of large industrial enterprises had been built or modernized. The Soviet assisted 156 key projects gave China a foundation in metallurgy, machinery, chemicals, aviation, and defense manufacturing scarcely existed that had scarcely existed a decade earlier. For the communist leadership, these achievements seemed to validate the effectiveness of centralized economic planning. Urban China changed rapidly. Millions of workers found employment in state owned factories. While new housing, hospitals, and schools accompanied industrial expansion, the government invested heavily in technical education, producing a new generation of engineers, scientists, and skilled industrial workers. Railways, roads, and power infrastructure expanded to connect factories with mines, ports, integrating regions that had previously been economically isolated. Yet these successes came with significant costs. Heavy industries absorbed the overwhelming share of investment, leaving consumer goods in short supply. Clothing, household products, and everyday necessities often remained scarce. Agricultural growth lagged behind industrial growth, even as the urban population expanded and demanded more food. The command economy also encouraged officials to prioritize meeting production quotas over efficiency, innovation, or product quality. Managers frequently focused on achieving numerical targets because promotions, political standing depended on fulfilling state plans rather than responding to actual economic demand. The apparent success of the first 5 year plan also had an unintended political consequence. Mao became convinced that China could accelerate development even further through mass political mobilization. If careful planning had produced rapid industrial growth, he reasoned, then revolutionary enthusiasm could achieve results that exceeded exceeded conventional economic limits. Many officials accepted this optimism, believing China could overtake the world's leading industrial nations far sooner than experts predicted. That confidence shaped one of the most consequential decisions in modern Chinese history. In 1958, immediately after the conclusion of the first 5 year plan, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward. Unlike the relatively disciplined and Soviet inspired planning of the previous 5 years, this new campaign relied on enormous people's communes, mass labor mobilization, and highly ambitious production targets. What had begun as a largely successful effort to establish China's industrial foundation would soon give way to an experiment whose consequences would prove catastrophic for the nation. Segment 5. The long term legacy of the first 5 year plan. The first 5 year plan left a legacy that extended far beyond its official end in 1957. It fundamentally altered China's economic structure, transforming the country from a predominantly agricultural society into one with a substantial industrial base. Many of the steel mills, machine building plants, rail networks, and power stations constructed during this period proved operating for decades, proving the infrastructure that later generations would expand and modernize. Politically, the plan greatly strengthened the authority of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. The the state's control over industry, banking, transportation, and agriculture became firmly established. Central planning evolved into the dominant mechanism for allocating resources, determining production, and directing investment. This concentration of economic authority gave the communist leadership unprecedented influence over every aspect of national development. Historians generally regard the first 5 year plan as one of the most successful economic campaigns of Mao's era. Unlike the radical movement that followed, it relied heavily on technical expertise, disciplined planning, and Soviet industrial experience. Industrial output grew rapidly. The urban workforce expanded, and China acquired technological capabilities that would have taken much longer to develop through gradual market growth alone. At the same time, the plan embedded structural weaknesses that would become increasingly problematic. The economy had become heavily dependent on bureaucratic decision making with limited flexibility to respond to changing conditions. Agriculture production was subordinated to industrial priorities, while consumer welfare remained secondary. The emphasis on fulfilling centrally assigned quotas sometimes rewarded inflated reporting and discouraged honest assessments of economic performance. These institutional habits would contribute to disastrous policy failures during the Great Leap Forward. In retrospect, the first 5 year plan represents both a major achievement and a cautionary lesson. It demonstrated that a determined state could rapidly mobilize to industrialize a poor country. It also showed that centralized planning could produce impressive short term gains when combined with disciplined administration and substantial investment. However, it revealed the dangers of concentrating economic decision making in a single political authority, especially when early successes fostered overconfidence. The industrial foundations laid between 1953 and 1957 helped shape the rise of modern China, but they also encouraged the leadership to embark on far more ambitious experiments whose human and economic costs would be far, far greater.